Hello, everybody. My name is Praveen Joseph. I'm a cybersecurity consultant and trainer working with the Ingram micro cybersecurity team, and I'm based in the Dubai office. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. It gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome you. And today we are going to be covering part 2 of Ingram Micro's GDPR Web Awareness series. The series is called this session is called the GDPR Implementation session, guys. And I'm really excited to have you on board because we have about 50 to 60 minutes left, over which time I'm going to run you through an actual GDPR implementation roadmap. We're going to take you through the various phases of this roadmap and then try to understand in each of these phases what really are the GDPR requirements, the top concerns, the top requirements that organizations need to worry about the most, and really try to identify what they need to do to actually address these requirements. So it's not possible for me to give you an extensive training on GDPR in this short duration of 50 to 60 minutes. So we'll be looking at the top concerns within each of these phases. All right, so welcome aboard once again, and let me quickly take you over the agenda just to give you an idea of what we've got planned for you today. For those of you who are not able to attend the GDPR Foundation session, which was part 1, we did it just about a little over 2 weeks back. This is a session that spoke about the what as well as the why aspects of GDPR. What is the motivation for bringing out this new regulation, and what is the end objective that it seeks to achieve? All these concepts were touched upon in the GDPR Foundation session. And today, we are making a logical progression to the next important question, namely the how-to of GDPR, that is the GDPR implementation, right? So this will be covered in section 2 of today's session, but for the benefit of those who are not able to attend the last session, we will do a quick recap of the basics, from the GDPR Foundation session. It's not going to be as extensive as the last one, of course, but we'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes quickly recapping the most important points, because these points are important for understanding section 2 of today's session. Right, and then in section 3, we're going to quickly look at what solutions Ingram Micro, that is our team, has actually set up for GDPR, what consultancy solutions, what training solutions we built, and that you can actually leverage, by just talking to us. We're going to have a quick look at these solutions as well as we go down. All right, guys, I'm all set. I'm really excited to take you down this journey. I hope you are as well. Stay with me. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat window at any point in time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take those questions as and when they arise, right? I do not want to park them to the end. Let's keep this as interactive as possible. Thank you so much. Great. Now, a quick recap of the GDPR Foundation session, guys. I've just put 2 slides in this section. And here, starting with this slide, we're going to look at what really is GDPR. All right, 4 key points that you need to know to quickly understand what GDPR really is. Guys, it's a new regulation that has been brought about to improve the standards of data privacy across the European Union. Okay, in case those of you are completely alien to the subject, just remember that it is a new regulation that has been brought about with the intent of improving data privacy, levels for European Union individuals. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more details. Now, I said it is a new regulation. You got to remember this. It's a regulation. It is not a directive. All right, there's a key difference here. GDPR is replacing what is now known as the Data Protection Directive. This is the current law that takes care of data privacy in Europe. It's called a directive, and it was introduced way back in 1995. Okay, so like you can imagine, it is pretty outdated by now, and a lot has happened in the area of technology and profiling of users, peeking into their personal lives with or without their consent by established organizations, so to speak. So a lot of developments have happened in the area of in the area of technology itself, and the Data Protection Directive is no longer highly relevant. Okay, now the directive was interesting in the sense, although it was introduced across the EU, each member state had the privilege of adopting it to their own unique national circumstances. All right, so if Italy had specific circumstances, they could tailor the directive to their own conditions, and so could France, so could Germany. So each country had its own, privilege or freedom of tailoring it to their unique national circumstances. However, GDPR is a regulation. It's not a directive. It's not a guideline. Rather, it is a set of rules which are immediately effective across all of the European Union member states. So what we are trying to achieve, what GDPR is trying to achieve is essentially in a very large sense is a consistent approach to data protection across all the EU member states. And plus, this is a regulation that has got teeth. It's got teeth, guys. I'm going to talk about that as well as we go down. What I really mean is the fines, the regulatory fines are super, super critical and can go up to the levels of 20 million euro. We'll discuss this as well as we go down. All right. On the right side, you see there is the main focus of GDPR really is on what we call personal data and sensitive personal data of European Union individuals. So what do I mean by personal and sensitive personal data? The definition really given by GDPR is personal data is any information that pertains to an identified or identifiable natural person. Okay, so this means that any data that can directly or indirectly relate to a person who is still living, deceased individuals are not covered in GDPR, who is still living is considered to be his or her personal data. And for more critical pieces of data, we have a special category called sensitive personal data. This is where your national identity, your racial origins, your trade union membership, your religious views, your political views, all these come under the category of sensitive personal data. And like you might have guessed, sensitive personal data warrants special categories or extra additional controls when it comes to protection under GDPR. All right. When I said EU individuals, you got to remember that only these are the people who are covered under GDPR. So, you got to be a resident or a citizen of an EU nation to be covered under GDPR. All right. Now, in terms of scope, you've got to understand now there's a common misconception in terms of GDPR. A lot of companies and entities that I've spoken to, they seem to believe that GDPR applies only to European Union organizations, those who are either European or those who are based in Europe or, those who are outside, but still they have strong EU ties. So opinions vary, but of course the fact still remains the same. GDPR applies to any organization, guys, across the world. It doesn't matter where you're located, as long as you're processing personal data of an EU individual or you're monitoring the behavior of an EU individual, as long as this behavior is carried out within the EU. Okay, so you can be any company located anywhere in the world, but if you're offering goods and services to an EU citizen or an EU resident, or if you are monitoring his or her behavior, by profiling or tracking their location, for example, on their phone, via whatever platform, it doesn't really matter where you're located. GDPR does apply to you. Okay. Non-compliance, guys, like I said, GDPR is a regulation that has been provided with a significant set of teeth. Non-compliance can lead to fines that can go up to the tune of 20 million euro or 4% of your total worldwide turnover. So this is one of the biggest reasons why GDPR has actually, colored the conversations of boardrooms, multiple boardrooms, because no organization wants to be the first one to receive that significant fine of 20 million euro. What do these fines entail, and how really can someone be held culpable? We will actually try to find out as we go down into section 2. Who are the key entities in GDPR, guys? I wanted to include this section as well from the GDPR Foundation session because it is really, really important that you understand the players. Although it is basic, I just want to make sure you are clear on this because this is essential to understanding the terms we'll look at in the next section, which is GDPR implementation. So quickly, a data subject, whom I will refer to as a DS in some of the slides, it is an identified or identifiable natural person. So the individual, right, that I was telling you about, the EU individuals, they are called data subjects. A data controller is the entity who determines the purposes as well as the means of the data processing. So for instance, you walk up to a bank and you submit your details to the bank in order to open a bank account. Yes, so you are the data subject here and the bank is the data controller because they collect your data, they determine the purpose for collecting the data, they determine the means through which your data is going to be processed. All right. There's also an entity called a data processor who is accountable to the data controller. This is, for example, a third-party entity who processes data on behalf of the data controller. So in the case of the bank, let's assume that you call into a call center of the bank. In most cases, you'll have seen that this is an outsourced entity who's sometimes not been located within the EU. So this entity processes your data on behalf of the bank. They have your name, your locations, all the details that you had submitted to the bank, your account number, your bank statements, your financial transactions. Everything is accessible to these guys, but they process it only as they have been instructed by the bank. All right, they are the data processor in this scenario. And lastly, we've got something called the supervisory authorities, also known as data protection authorities. Each EU member state has a national level data protection authority. These are bodies that were already in existence within the EU, and now they have been empowered to enforce the new GDPR within their own member states. Okay, so data controllers are answerable to the supervisory authorities, and at the end of the day, the objective really is for GDPR to give back control to data subjects of their own personal data. And that is the reason that, you know, the supervisory authority acts in support of the data subject. Data controller has to report to the supervisory authority. The data processor also reports to the supervisory authority, but of course we are the data controller, right? So you see these lines of accountability as well that are drawn across over here. All right, guys. So with this foundational information, let us get down to the core of today's session, which is GDPR implementation. I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of the key phases that will be involved in implementing a GDPR compliance framework across any organization. Now, this framework, as you can see, is extremely generic. All right, there is nothing industry specific, there is nothing sector specific or organization specific that you see here. You start with a general assessment of where you stand right now and what really you need to do to, you know, to cover those remaining phases successfully. Based on the assessment, you design your controls, you implement them in phase 3, and finally you try to maintain and sustain your compliance on an ongoing basis. This is a typical, you know, set of steps that are involved in executing any data security or data privacy compliance framework. So I'm going to use this, and what we'll do is we'll map the GDPR requirements to each of these phases. Okay, so this is where it's going to get really interesting, guys, because we're going to look at each of the GDPR requirements and then map them down to these phases. We're going to start with phase 1, guys, which is the assessment phase. We'll start with a quick understanding of what the phase really is, and then we will map it down to the GDPR requirements that will be coming under this particular phase. All right, now to keep the things, you know, to keep things, the information that is presented here visually easy to, you know, digest is why we've kept a lot of icons, a lot of pictographic information, not much text, guys, as you can see on the slides. Bear in mind that there is a small infographic on the top right, which shows you really which phase we are on. So this can help you keep track as we go down the slides. So be with me, guys, because this is where things are going to get really interesting. So phase 1, we are with the assessment phase. The requirement of GDPR really that comes under the assess phase, all right, is shown on the left side of the screen, as well as how we are going to approach this is shown on the right side. All right, so what do I mean by assess really? Under the assessment phase, I'm going to try and understand what really I need to do to achieve GDPR compliance and where I stand today, where my organization stands today. All right, so step 1 would be for me to really understand what is the material and territorial scope of my organization within GDPR. Now, this is a new or heavily updated section under GDPR, so that's the reason I've highlighted it as new. If it's been updated, you'll see the words updated written over here. And this is a new requirement under GDPR, right? So obviously, because it's completely extraterrestrial to the European Union as well, organizations outside of the EU are also being included. So your approach is to understanding the material and territorial scope. Look at whether you as an organization are storing or processing data pertaining to EU individuals, okay? Secondly, look at whether you are monitoring data pertaining to EU individuals. Next, look at whether you're an EU establishment who is based in the European Union and then conducting the above activities. GDPR, yes, it applies to you. Secondly, even if you are a global entity, no matter where you're located in the world, if you are you know, conducting these two activities, that is offering goods or services to an EU individual, or you are offering, you're monitoring the behavior of an EU individual as and when it occurs in the EU, yes, GDPR applies to you. All right, so you got to really define the borders or the boundaries of your GDPR applicability. So like, to repeat, any storage, processing, or transmission of personal data pertaining to an EU individual is potentially, is potentially to be scoped in under GDPR. If you're an EU establishment or whether you're a global entity who's doing this, GDPR does apply to you. All right, the second point is the appointment of what is known as a data protection officer, the DPO. Guys, GDPR mandates that any organization that is involved in large-scale processing or large-scale monitoring of individuals, EU individuals, of course, has to appoint a DPO. Also, if you're a public authority, you have to appoint a DPO. But what really is this DPO, guys? A DPO is a data protection officer. Is supposed to be a champion of data privacy, a GDPR champion really within the organization. So he's supposed to have a lot of expert knowledge in the area of data protection and privacy. He's supposed to really, drive awareness within the organization, make sure the GDPR program is in place and that all the requirements are being followed on an ongoing basis. He also will have to liaise with the external entities like the supervisory authority that I told you about, or even with the data subjects when they contact the organization. He would typically have to liaise with them to make sure that all the GDPR obligations of the organization are actually being met. All right, now this individual, of course, he has a couple of exclusive rights as well. He is to report to the highest level of management within the organization. Plus, he will be given a lot of access to trainings and other resources to make sure that his knowledge is updated at all points in time. So it's a really good position to be in, but of course, it brings with it a lot of requirements, a lot of job description activities that this particular individual has to really carry out in a very, very effective way. All right, another requirement that GDPR has brought about, a new requirement rather, which really has to be carried out at the SS phase is something that is called the Data Protection Impact Assessment. So what do I mean by DPIA? Data privacy or a data protection impact assessment really looks at what are the privacy impacts that a product or a service can bring about. So what do I mean by this? Suppose I'm launching a new product into the market, and for leveraging this product, you are asking users to actually submit their personal details. All right, how are you collecting this detail, and where are you storing it? What are the impacts to the privacy of this individual if this particular data gets breached, or gets compromised? These are the kinds of questions that have to be asked, and answers have to be derived within this data protection impact assessment. When does GDPR mandate that you carry out this activity? Before any high-risk project has commenced. So to give you the same example, suppose you are requiring that you collect sensitive personal data of your customers before you make the product available to them. This is typically a high-risk project. The definition of GDPR is that it provides a very significant risk to the rights and freedoms of the natural data subjects. So if a project is providing a significant risk to their rights and freedoms, yes, it is a high-risk project. And before you start the project itself, GDPR requires that you carry out a DPIA. Plus, it has to be signed off by your data protection officer. Your DPO has to sign off on it. Plus, if your outcome of your DPIA exercise is a high risk, you will definitely have to report it to your lead supervisory authority. Okay, so this is another requirement. Organizations have to make sure that their DPI is carried out when it has to be done, is documented properly. The risks are approved by the DPI, by the DPO. And finally, if you have an unmitigated risk at the end of the exercise, you have to report it to the lead supervisory authority. We're coming down to phase 2, guys, which is a design phase. Essentially, we are going to try and design the controls around our GDPR compliance program. What are the key areas that GDPR is asking you to look at in this section? First of all, guys, you need to look at what are your data processing principles. Okay, now in the foundation section, in the foundations webinar, we had actually covered this section in significant detail. GDPR requires that any processing of personal data has to be in compliance with the data processing principles, which is it has to be lawful. That is, you're processing data for a legal basis. Plus, it should be fair and transparent to the data subject. And your purpose for collecting the data should be minimal. It should be limited and clearly stated for that matter. The data that you collect should be proportionate to the purpose for which you're processing the data, right? So for instance, to open a bank account, you only need N number of details of a particular employee or a particular data subject. You don't need to collect each and every piece of information about him. So collect only that data which is relevant to the purpose. Then retain the data for a defined retention period, which is storage limitation. Make sure the data is accurate, so you don't have to keep going back to the customer to collect additional data and verify the accuracy of the data you already have, right? Make sure you have mechanisms to validate the accuracy of the data. Make sure the security of the data, integrity and confidentiality is upheld at all points in time. All right, these data processing principles are the foundations of GDPR, and really within the scoped environment that you had identified earlier, you have to make sure that every piece of data that resides is actually in compliance with these principles. How do you go about doing that? You need to make a data inventory. You need to document all the data flows and life cycles. And finally, conduct a gap assessment against each and every piece of data that you have, identified in steps 1 and 2 here. Conduct a gap assessment against the DPP, the data processing principles. Wherever you see issues, raise a red flag and you need to get them fixed. All right, 2 other important areas that GDPR brings about are the data protection by design as well as data protection by default. What do I mean by this, guys? Data protection by design. Now look at this picture here. It clearly shows what is a typical product development life cycle, right? You start with the requirements phase, then you gather the requirements for the product, you design the product, you develop it. If it's, for example, an application, you write the code, you deploy the code, and then you provide support to the customers who are using the product. Based on user feedback, you will again, update your requirements, and then the whole loop continues again. Now, usually what happens in security and privacy is the security requirements or the privacy requirements are identified only in the support and the feedback phases. Okay, they're not identified in the earlier phases of requirement itself, and nor in the design phase itself. GDPR requires that you start identifying your privacy and security controls in the design phase itself. So what this means is security and privacy becomes an inherent component of the product. Even before you start developing or building it, at the end of the day, your security and privacy requirements are inherently built into the product. This makes a lot of difference, a lot of seamlessness in the way security or privacy is approached in the product. This is a new requirement in GDPR, and again, organizations have to scope it in, see how they're going to build it into their, for example, applications that deal with sensitive personal data, the websites, or any of the services as well that they render to European Union individuals. Another requirement is data protection by default. This is a new concept again, which is brought in by GDPR, but if you are familiar with security speak, you'll know that data protection by default, security by default is not a new concept at all. What we're really talking about here is making sure that the default security requirements are such that the privileges offered to the user are minimal and the security offered to the data is maximum. So for instance, when you are provided access to, let's say a server as a basic user, right, your access to the server will not have the same privileges that an admin user has. You might not be able to add additional users. You might not be able to review the logs on the server. You might not be able to change your own privileges on the server. So your privileges are proportionate to the job description that you have, your job responsibilities, and it is sufficient or minimalistic to make sure that you are enabled to carry out your activities on the server. Whereas an admin user would have higher and more elevated levels of privileges, of course. This is essentially security by default. All right, when this concept is violated, what I'm doing is I'm giving admin access to everybody, whether or not they need it. Okay, that's where this concept is being violated. GDPR says that this is a huge no-no. By default, this whole concept of security by default or privacy, data protection by default has to be built into all your products and services that deal with EU personal data. All right, one of the good ways of attesting or demonstrating that you have compliance with DPD, data protection by design or by default, is by getting your product certified. How this is going to be done, it really remains to be seen. GDPR has a new concept of certified, approved monitoring bodies and certification bodies. These organizations have to be set up and will be authorized to review organizations' compliance postures, and even sometimes, maybe certify their products and services as well against GDPR. This is going to be interesting. It's to see really how these organizations span out and what their activities are going to be like. Okay, another concept, of course, is the importance of data protection policies and procedures. Once you have designed your controls, you really need to document them down so you have sufficient accountability, sufficient governance, as well as roles and responsibilities being laid down. And of course, your senior management has to sign off on your policies and procedures. They have to be really well written at first by trained and qualified individuals. Your senior management signs off on them, and then the governance structures are approved. The frequencies at which these policies are reviewed are documented in the policies itself. And lastly, they have to be circulated to all the employees in the organization. So this can be either over an email with a link to the intranet, or it can just be an email with an attachment. Whatever the best is the best way that works for the company, it has to be carried out such that all employees are notified and all employees have an access to the policies and procedures at any point in time. Great. So this is it, guys, with phase 2, which was the design phase. You're jumping into phase 3, where you have to implement, you really have to execute things. You start carrying out your day-to-day business processes once you have started designing your controls. Now, there are certain requirements in GDPR which will come under this particular phase, and this is what we're going to look at right now, starting with consent and data subject rights. Guys, these are two really, really significant, heavily updated areas within GDPR. Consent is something, what do I mean by consent? As an end user, I'm required to, acknowledge that I'm okay with my data being processed by a data controller. All right, now, for example, you might have noticed when you visit websites that are, owned by companies in the EU, you always would have received a pop-up that says this website uses cookies and you are okay with, using these cookies. Now, this is a requirement from a previous regulation called the e-privacy directive. It mandated that all organizations within the EU, if they're using cookies to track users' behaviors on their website, they will have to mandatorily obtain consent from the users for doing this. That's the reason all EU websites have this pop-up that comes up. You are required to click on OK, and so that the pop-up disappears. However, when you think about it, you can still use the website without clicking on OK. It is not mandatory that you have to click OK just to use the website. So the way in which you're giving your consent there is not really question-free. There can be a couple of questions raised. So GDPR really is trying to break down the whole concept of consent. It's really, really clear in terms of what needs to be done when it comes to consent. Consent has to be freely given. It shouldn't be forced upon the individual. It shouldn't be like, hey, you can't use my service unless you consent. This is a big no-no under GDPR. Next one, it has to be specific. So for each instance of personal data that you're going to be collecting, you will have to get specific consent from the individuals. It has to be well informed, so the individual is properly educated on what really he's consenting to, he or she. And it has to be unambiguous. There should be specific and clear-cut definitions of really what consent is being obtained. No unambiguity, guys. And there's also the concept of explicit consent, which is consent that is obtained, that is provided actively by the data subject. This is also an important definition which comes under GDPR. Explicit consent is required for certain cases, like, for example, transferring data to a country which does not meet the European Union's definitions of adequacy, right? So consent is really, really well laid out in GDPR. The second thing, so when it comes to consent, all you need to do is identify the areas where you are, depending on consent for, as a basis for processing of the personal data. Make sure that this consent, that these areas where you're collecting consent is not in violation of GDPR's requirements. See, if you need to get explicit consent, you'll have to make sure your consent is really meeting the, the checklist that GDPR has for what constitutes explicit consent. Make sure that, pretext boxes, silence, etc. These are all, not considered to be consent, and make sure that you do not have them really under any of your circumstances. And at the end of the day, make sure that any area where you are relying on consent is in compliance with what GDPR needs, right? Next thing is data subjects' rights. Yes, this is another landmark area where GDPR is really empowering data subjects or citizens of the EU and residents. You have new and really, really enhanced rights. You have the right to object to processing for legitimate reasons, of course. You have a right to access a copy of your data that is being held by the data controller. So if you have a Facebook or a Gmail account, Google account, of course, you can at any point in time request a copy of all your data that these companies hold, and they are required by law to grant it to you within a specific timeline. Okay, you can also request transfer of your data from one company to the other. So if you're not happy with Dropbox's services and you want to transfer your data, all their files from Dropbox to, let's say, Google Drive, you have a right to request Dropbox to transfer all your data, all your files to Google. All right, so what we're talking about, when you think about it, guys, how technically feasible are these things going to be? You need to sometimes set up a web page just so that users can request a copy of the data. You'll have to make sure that your data, from your database, is technically compatible with those of other service providers. So from the technical feasibility standpoint, this, when you think about it, the implications are going to be massive. All right, so try to identify where you might be facing challenges, where the technological background or the infrastructure that you're being used is likely to pose compatibility problems. Try to make sure that you have an idea of these, and look at make sure that you realize you have specific timelines within which the data subjects access requests have to be fulfilled. So make sure that you have mechanisms to meet these timelines. It's not very long, so please be sure that you meet these timelines. All right. Cross-border data transfers, this again is another significant and heavily updated area of GDPR. Now, within the European Union, the European Commission has actually identified a set of 11 countries across the world, like, for example, Switzerland, the Faroe Islands, Guernsey, Uruguay, etc. These countries have been deemed by the European Commission as meeting and providing an adequate level of data protection. So if you're transferring data to these countries, it is okay. All right. So make sure you have a list of these 11 countries and check if you're transferring your data, the personal data, to these countries. It's fine. If not, and this is what happens in most of the cases, if these countries don't fall, if your countries don't fall under this list, you'll have to have appropriate safeguards or derogations on which basis you'll have to transfer your data. So identify these appropriate safeguards, like you have, for example, binding corporate rules, BCRs, you have model clauses or standard contractual clauses, a whole set of lists of appropriate safeguards have been provided under GDPR. Make sure that you have chosen the one that is best for you. You also have derogations, like, for example, explicit consent that I mentioned earlier. And there is another very interesting derogation, which is compelling legitimate interests. Okay, so at the end of it, GDPR says that if you have a compelling legitimate interest, you can transfer data on the basis of that interest, provided the transfer is pertaining to a limited number of data subjects. It's for a limited period of time, and that you have taken appropriate due diligence measures and you have applied appropriate controls, technical and organizational. So there's going to be a lot of documentation, guys, if you're going to go in with this option, but make sure that you have mechanisms in place to prove that you have met all these requirements if you're going to go with the compelling legitimate interests criterion. All right. Lastly, we have data pseudonymization. This is again a new control, new concept that has been brought in by GDPR. What do I mean by pseudonymization? Guys, if you're familiar with database tables, you must be familiar with the concept of primary key and foreign key, right? So a foreign key is a temporary pseudonym, right, which can be used to refer to each individual record in a primary table. So let me give you an example. You've got a list of names of students in table A, which is your primary table. Now I can refer to these students either by their names or I can refer to them by numbers. Okay, as long as I have a way of mapping these numbers back to the students, I'm okay. The moment I lose this mapping between the two tables, I'll have a significant problem. Okay, so if I really secure this mapping and keep it sufficiently, under lock and key, I can refer to the numbers, I can process these numbers, I can circulate them without any risk to the names of the students being, or the names of the people being revealed, right? This is exactly the concept of data pseudonymization. You develop a pseudonym for each record, and then you develop a way to map these pseudonyms back to the records. As long as you've secured this mapping, the algorithm that maps it back. Bear in mind, this is not encryption, guys. It's not as secure as encryption. It's just what GDPR refers to as pseudonymization. As long as you have a mechanism to map things back, you are okay. Okay, so make sure you have identified a list of data that is suitable for this particular technique of data pseudonymization. GDPR brings in a lot of rewards, guys, if you invest in data pseudonymization. You have a lot of exemptions on your obligations, like in relation to processing data subjects' rights. So for instance, when you contact Dropbox asking for a copy of your data, if the data has been pseudonymized by Dropbox, they don't need to provide it to you, because they'll say, sorry, we don't have a way to map your data back to you. Unfortunately, if you can still provide the data that they need to map you to their data, to map you to your data, then Dropbox will have to provide you with the data. So unfortunately for them, there still are workarounds, but in most cases, if your data has been pseudonymized, Dropbox does not have to give you a copy of your data. Similarly, breach notification is another area we'll talk about later, but if your data has been breached and it has been pseudonymized and is unlikely to be used for carrying out an attack against you, the company gets significant exemptions in terms of what they need to do, who they need to notify about this particular breach. Okay, so a lot of rewards in terms of data pseudonymization, only two of which I have mentioned. Please make sure that you balance the costs versus the benefits, and identify where you need to pseudonymize your data, where it is extremely important that you do this, and go ahead and execute it. Okay, lastly, we are coming to the sustenance phase, wherein you'll have to identify mechanisms to maintain your GDPR compliance at all points in time. The most important phase is at any time your compliance is breached, your security compliance is breached, you have a data security incident, you are required to be aware of your breach notification obligations under GDPR. So Articles 33 and 34 talk about this. If you're a data processor, you should notify your data controller with immediate effect. Okay, and your data controller has to notify the supervisory authority within just about 72 hours. All right, and of course, the DPO should play a significant role in front-ending these conversations, making sure everything about the incident is reported, documented in a proper format, and then reported to the SA. If the breach leads to a high risk to the freedoms and rights of data subjects, the data controller might have to notify the data subjects as well. All right, so be aware of these consequences. Make sure you have a proper incident management process in place, and it is a significant concept component of your incident of your privacy maintenance phase. If at all you are notified of a breach, be aware that you just have about 72 hours within which you have to notify your supervisory authority. Lastly, we have data security as well as regulatory fines. In terms of data security, yes, it is a significant component. Cybersecurity is considered to be a significant component of GDPR. You're required to have ongoing assessments of your security posture. Make sure that you have a framework within which all the important concepts that we discussed, like breach notification, data protection by default and design, pseudonymization, all these have to be vital components of your security compliance program. All right, and lastly, guys, we're coming down to fines. At any point when you are in violation, you're deemed culpable of violating GDPR requirements, you can be subject to fines that go up to the tune of 20 million euro or 4% of your total worldwide turnover. Below, I've shown some of the areas where, if violated, you can face the fines. So we have two levels of fines, 10 as well as 20 million euro. And if you are in violation of factors pertaining to children's consent, DPO appointment, data protection by design or default, security or breach notification, your fines can be as high as 10 million euro or 2% of your worldwide total annual turnover. And whereas for violation of data protection principles or cross-border data transfers or the rights of your data subjects, you will sometimes have to face fines as high as 20 million euro or 4% of your worldwide annual turnover. Guys, I hope this was helpful because we have completed the phase-wise approach of the GDPR implementation. We have looked at the key requirements in each phase and tried to identify how to approach each of these requirements. With this background, let me give you an overview of what solutions we have here from Ingram Micro on GDPR. This is the final section 3 of the session. We have a whole set of trainings, guys, on GDPR. And in fact, you were attending what constitutes part 1 of our trainings, which is the Web Awareness series. These are free sessions which are delivered online, predominantly talking about the what, why, as well as the how-to of GDPR. Two sets of sessions, the GDPR Foundations as well as the GDPR Implementation. They really help to spread awareness, and this is the core objective of these sessions. We have certification trainings, guys, on CIPP as well as CIPM. These are the most relevant certifications on GDPR. When I told you a data protection officer has to be really qualified and experienced in terms of his proficiency under the area of data privacy, these are the two certifications that have to be looked out for. And in fact, this is not coming from me. This is coming from multiple studies, including those that have been done by Oxford, the Oxford University of England. Okay. Under the consultancy side, all of the activities that we discussed in in a phase-wise approach in section 2 of today's session, we can actually do them for organizations. So if organizations need help in carrying out a data protection impact assessment, they need their policies and procedures written from a data privacy standpoint. They need to classify their data to actually, develop the data inventories that we looked at. They need to do security risk assessments or mechanisms to manage their incidents, document in line with GDPR requirements. We can do this for them. So if at all you have any customers, partners who are looking at, how to go about implementing the GDPR compliance framework, we are ready to actually go around and help them to do it. Lastly, of course, we have technical assessments. Public discovery reports, which I'm sure you're familiar with, are free, reports which try to identify publicly available information of the end customers. We provide them to the partners who can go to the customers and try to initiate the security conversation around them. We do vulnerability assessments, web app scans, pen tests, all the remote security assessment services. We do these as well. A quick slide on the importance of the two certifications. Like I said, they are the most relevant certifications for a DPO to hold, CIPP Europe and CIPM. We have tied up with the IAPP, which is International Association of Privacy Professionals. We have certified trainers, guys. In fact, I myself hold a CIPP/E, and we are ready to actually come down and deliver these trainings wherever in the world, in Europe or the Middle East or Africa region. You need these trainings to be done. We are ready to come down and deliver the trainings. These are 2-day trainings, and they are they are more suited for DPO candidates, or data protection, data protection lawyers, privacy managers, etc. The next steps, guys, from this session, we have a GDPR solutions sheet. I'm going to make sure I email it to you after today's session. Please do continue to attend as well as invite your partners for our web awareness series. I'll make sure you get the invitations as we schedule more of these series, of these sessions in future. And then lastly, let's start delivering trainings and projects, guys. Please talk to your partners. Please talk to your end customers. Wherever there's a GDPR requirement, feel free to loop us in. We're more than happy to deliver with you. All right, guys, thank you so much for your attendance. I'm gonna request your questions, your feedback. I'll be sending you a link to a survey, and wherein I will collect your feedback on the session. Apart from that, if you have any questions, feel free to email them to me. I've not received any chat questions. Thank you so much, guys, for your time and attention today. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.